Welcome to Symfony Workshop. I'm Gary Clarke, and this is a full 80-minute Symfony test-driven development course in which I'm going to build out a service which is able to contact a third-party API and use the return data to update a database. I'm going to show you a whole bunch of components, techniques and good practices, so there'll be plenty of stuff for you to take away and use in your own applications, including Symfony HttpClient, doctrine, entities, repositories and queries, PHP unit tests, feature tests and integration tests. I'll cover console commands, the maker bundle. I'll show you how to create test fakes in order to mimic integration with external services, and I'll show you how to set up an SQLite test database which runs only in memory and resets after each test. As well as that, I'll also show you how to set up a dev database using Symfony's integration with Docker. And I'm also going to create and update entities from raw JSON using Symfony Serializer component. And I'll round the whole lot off with some API error handling and some logging using Monologue. There's a lot more stuff in addition to that, but if I sat and listed everything, the introduction would be as long as the content. So let's get into it. If you want to see my code, I'll leave a link to the GitHub repository down in the comments below. And if you do have any questions, don't be afraid to ask, because I do answer them all. And if you do enjoy the course, be sure to like and share. Some information before we get started. I record in high resolution, so you don't have to watch on a blurry screen. Choose high definition if that works for you. Do you want to join a growing group of PHP developers and take your skills to a new level? If that sounds like you, all you need to do is subscribe and click the little notification icon, and welcome. This is the platform we're going to use. This is RapidAPI, which is an excellent platform for developers to test out all different kinds of APIs. And the one we're going to use is Yahoo Finance. So we're going to ping the API, which we'll do using the HTTP client. We're going to grab the details for a particular stock. In our case, we'll use Amazon, and then we're going to grab a handful of those details and store them in a database. And we're going to drive the whole thing out using test-driven development. I'll kick things off by creating a new Symfony project, and I'll call it Yahoo API. And I'm going to specify version 5.2. So that's installing. Now let's grab some packages that we're going to need from Composer. So Symfony Composer require, so we need HTTP client to make our API requests, doctrine, maker bundle and PHP unit. Now like I say, we're going to drive the whole thing out with tests. We're going to go for maximum test coverage on this. So the way we'll start out is by writing a test just to get our test environment set up and everything in place for when we start writing code. So here's a test called stock test, and it extends kernel test case, which comes from framework bundle test kernel test case. I'm just going to write a bit of a nonsensical test which will assert that true is true. And what this will do though is it'll pull in all the rest of our dependencies which haven't yet been installed, and it'll just prove to us that what we have so far is all up and running. So over to the terminal, Symfony PHP bin/PHP unit tests/stock test. And as you can see, it's triggered Composer here, which is going to pull in a load of stuff which hasn't yet been installed. And you'll have seen that PHP unit ran and that our test passed. Now what I'm doing is I'm setting up an in-memory SQLite test database. So I grab the SQLite line from .env, I paste it into .env test, and I replace this file path with :memory:. Now using an in-memory test database like we're doing here has loads of benefits. For us, one of the main things is it gets us up and running quickly, and it's very fast and lightweight. I almost always start out with this setup where I can get away with it. Our next step is to grab a bundle which it will return our database to its previous state once the tests have run, so there's no hangover, no leftovers after we've run our tests. This is the command. I'll leave a link to the docs down below so you can copy that. It says, do you want to execute the recipe? Just choose P like I did. Then next we need to enable it as a PHP unit extension or listener. So you should be using 7.5 or higher like me. So grab the extensions tab, go over to phpunit.xml.dist and just paste it in here. I'm just pasting it above listeners. Our third and final setup step is to be able to migrate our database when we run the tests each time. Because our database is in memory, we can't pre-migrate. So this guy Andrew has kindly posted this database primer, which is, I've used it for a couple of years. It's absolutely brilliant, does the job. and I'll also leave a link to that down below. The way we do it is this: create a database primer class inside the test folder, and then just cut and paste that code into here. So copy my use statement for the kernel interface. The way it works is this: it checks that we're in the test environment. If not, it throws an exception, because you don't want to be doing this on a dev or production database. The way this works is it looks at all your entity metadata from your annotations, and then using the schema tool, it uses that metadata to update the schema. So make sure you've pulled in the schema tool also in your use statement. And then now we need to prime our database in the setup function of our test class. So kernel equals self :boot kernel, and then you just call database primer prime, and you pass in the kernel as the lone argument. We're going to need some entity manager methods, so let's add the entity manager to our test. So private entity manager, and then we'll also create this in our setup method. So the way we do that is this: entity manager equals kernel get container get, and then pass in the string doctrine, and then just call get manager on the end of all that, and you'll have an entity manager. Okay, let's go over and run our tests and see where we're up to. Okay, no errors, so everything's running okay. The only thing is we're getting this deprecation notice. So sometimes in your tests you will get deprecation notices. Here's a way to silent them. Inside the PHP tags of our PHP unit XML file, just add an environment variable, Symfony deprecations helper, all uppercase with underscores, and I just use a value of disabled. I've seen other values used. I'll be totally straight with you, I just want them to go away. I'm not too concerned with the underlying functionality that makes them go away. The good news is we now have a fast, lightweight, flexible, in-memory SQLite test database which rolls back to its previous state at the end of each test. So give yourself a pat on the back, that's the boring stuff out of the way. Now let's start having some fun. We're going to write our first test, so all functionality that we do is going to be driven out with tests. We write the test first, and then we write code, or just enough code to make those tests pass. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to break in gently. If you might not have done TDD before, so we'll just test that a stock record can be created in the database. Our tests will all follow this format: setup, do something, make assertions. So these are the fields that we're going to need. They're all going to come direct from the API, except for this last one, price change, which we're going to calculate ourselves as price minus previous close. Okay, so the first thing we're going to need is a stock. So we'll create that first. Obviously, there's no such thing as a stock in our code just yet. Our tests are going to tell us exactly what code we need to write, and we're not going to write a single line of code that we don't need. We're going to set our properties using typical entity camel case setters. So set symbol, we're going to be using Amazon, which is AMZN. I'll fly through the rest of these because you don't want to watch me doing all these. I'm sure you'll get bored of that. So we have symbol, short name, currency, exchange name, region. For the price change, we're going to need variables because we need to calculate price minus previous close. So the way we'll do that is we create the variables, do the maths, and then set the values afterwards. And so what we'll be looking for here is a price change of minus 100. Just doing it that way to make sure that our database is also handling negatives as well as positives. So covering off these last three: stock, set price, set previous close, set price change. Once we've done that, what we need to do is persist this in the database, and we do that using this entity manager. I'm going to actually add a doc block here so I'll get a bit of code completion. So we'll just put entity manager interface, and we're saying this entity manager persist. Now this doesn't actually persist anything in the database at the moment, it just brings it under the entity manager's management. We persist it when we call this entity manager flush, and that is really our action. That's the act part of our test, or the inverted commas do something, as we've decided to call it. Now we need to grab a stock repository, and we do that with this entity manager get repository, and we pass in the class name of our stock entity. And the reason we're grabbing the repository is because we want to query the database to see what has been persisted there, and so we can perform assertions against it. So because the database gets rolled back at the end of all the tests, there should only be one record in there, so we're just looking for one stock record with a symbol of AMZN. We'll finish off this test by just writing some assertions to make sure that every single field is being set correctly. And what I'd advise in your code is that you always have at least one test which checks that every single field is being set correctly, because things change, and if you don't have that safety net there, you could break other parts of your code. Having maximum test coverage is by far the quickest and easiest way to check whether something has broke. Let's run our test now and see what we discover. Okay, error. Class app tests stock not found. This is good. This is what we expected, and it's actually what we wanted. PHP unit is now telling us exactly what we need to do, which is only a good thing. So let's actually create that entity. Symfony console make :entity stock. So let's add our fields. Luckily I've got them written in front of me. We need symbol, that can be a length of 4 as in AMZN. We need currency, that's going to be USD in our case, so that can be a string, 3 characters. Exchange name, that is also a string, and that can be 30 characters. Price, so for this, if you put a question mark, it shows you what fields are available. We're going to choose decimal. If you're using financials, decimal is better than floats, it's more precise. Leave the default precision, choose a scale of 2. Price change, exactly the same as what we did for price, so it'll be decimal, 10 precision, scale 2. We'll allow it to be nullable. Previous close, same as for price change, decimal, precision of 10, scale of 2. That can also be nullable. Region, this is going to be a string 3. Short name, string also, let's go with 30. That can also be nullable, and we'll just hit enter again, and that completes the process. So here's our stock entity that process generates for us, and here's all our getters and setters, which hopefully should match the ones we've created. Change stock to use app entity stock, so if you check out the top of my file, I'm using app entity stock. Let's run the test. We have an error, undefined variable price change on line 38. Yep, no idea what I was doing there. It should be price minus previous close. So that's fixed. Let's go and run the tests again. And we have green, 1 test, 7 assertions. Excellent. Let's change something for a little sanity check. That good. That breaks. Probably not the best example. Let's go and break one of our assertions. So instead of minus 100, we'll make this minus 101. Excellent. Failed asserting that minus 100 matches minus 101, but it got to that point, meaning all the other previous tests had passed. So let's have a quick look at where we left off. We created this stock test for just testing that we can create a stock entity and deposit it in the database. I'll just run that and to prove it works. So we're making 7 assertions against all the fields that we can add. Before we get stuck in, I'm just going to enhance our setup and tear down. So I'm voiding the return, and for the tear down, I'm just going to close down the entity manager and set it to null, so that we don't have an entity manager which is still hanging on to data from previous tests, which would be bad. And so with that done, let's get into the good stuff, and I'm going to start by creating a feature folder in my tests folder, and this is going to hold my feature tests, which are entire pieces of functionality from start to finish. So normally you'd think of them as your request and response when you're using HTTP. We're actually building an automated process, and we're going to use commands, so it will be that entire process of executing a command, hitting the API and getting the data back and storing it. That is the full feature. So inside of there, I've created a test called refresh stock profile command test, which again extends kernel test case, and I'm just pasting in the setup and teardown from my stock test. So it is blatant duplication, but we're going to stick to the rule of 3 principle here, which says that it's probably not much to be gained by refactoring if you've only got 2 duplicates, but once you have 3 or more, then it's worth considering refactoring. So here's our test. For lack of a better name for now, I'm just going to call it the refresh stock profile command behaves correctly. Exactly the same steps as our stock test: to set up, do something, make assertions. Let's go over to the console, and if I put Symfony console, what you see here is a list of commands with their descriptions, which says exactly what they do, or gives you an idea what they do. What I want to do is create a command, and I want to be able to execute it using something like this: Symfony console app:/refresh stock profile. And we're going to create the command and drive out all of its functionality using our feature test. So like most things in Symfony, commands are easily testable, and there are helper classes which will help us do that. So first off, I need to access this application class. So I think I've got the right one here. We'll soon find out if I haven't. And then using this application class, or using our application object that we've just created, we can then find our command. The way we do that is like this: command equals application find, and then we just use the string which makes up the command name. And so this becomes a static property on the class, as we'll see shortly. What I'm creating here is a command tester instance, which is an instance of the command tester class, and this is a special class which helps us test Symfony console commands. And the way we do it is we can just execute the command like this: command tester execute. Our console commands can take arguments, and we're going to take advantage of that because there's some information which we will need to pass to the API in order to get the information back, and those things are the symbol, as in the stock symbol, and we also will need the region. So we can pass these 2 pieces of information into the command as our arguments, and this is what we mean here. So if we look at the API documentation, it says we need the symbol and the region there. So obviously the execution of the command is the do something part of our test. We then need to follow that up with some assertions, and all we're going to assert is that after executing the command, that a record has been created in the database, and that data will be what was retrieved from the Yahoo Finance API. So I'm just calling find one by on the repository, on the stock repository, find one by symbol Amazon. So there should only be one record in the database if this is run correctly. I just need to check that the fields contain the values that I'm expecting. So for all these string values here, currency, exchange name, they're going to be the same each time anyway, so I know what to expect there. But for previous close and for the stock price, well, those things are going to vary, so I'm just going to put in a sensible assertion here to assert that the value is greater than 50. All of our assertions are in place. Let's run the test and see where that gets us. So PHP unit test feature refresh stock profile command test, and already we can see we have an error, and my guess was incorrect. I had the wrong application. So instead of that one, what we actually need is this Symfony bundle framework bundle console application. Let's run the test again, and we have our next error. So this is good. It says there are no commands defined in the app namespace, and so we've defined our command here. It's telling us that this doesn't exist, so let's go and create it. So each step of the way we're asking PHP unit for something, and PHP unit is telling us what to do in order to get it. So I'm creating the command here, which you can do from the console with Symfony console make : command, then just give the command name. Let's go and see what was created. So in source command we have this refresh stock profile command. So it's taken the hyphenated refresh stock profile part of the name that we specified and then created a class name out of that by appending the word command on the end. Let's run the tests again. Okay, progress. So now it's saying that the symbol argument does not exist. So if we look at the do something part of our test, we are trying to execute the command and we've passed in a symbol argument. If we look at the refresh stock profile command class, It's split into two methods, configure and execute. In the configure part of the test, this is where you specify your arguments. So we're going to replace this default of arg1 and we'll create our own, and we're going to say that it is required. We need to give it a description, and we'll just say that this is the stock symbol, e.g. AMZN for Amazon. We might as well add our region argument while we're here. We'll also give that a description, region of the company, and this set description method is the description for the entire command. What does the command do? With that in place, let's run the tests again. Our next error, the arg1 argument does not exist. So if we look at the execute method of the command, we have all this default stuff which is already placed in there. Let's delete that, run the tests again, and now we're getting somewhere. Call to member function get currency on null from line 61 of our test. Let's go and see what that is. So it's saying we're calling get currency on null. So no stock was found in the database. This is good because this tells us what needs to happen next. With test-driven development, you're constantly looking for your shortest path back to green. And so that's what we're going to do here by creating a stock and then just giving it the field values that our test is expecting. Hopefully we'll get green, and then we'll go back and refactor from there to get us to this point. So you don't need to see me add all of these. I'll just speed up the editing a bit there. And then we're going to need an entity manager to persist this. So let's create a constructor and we'll inject it into that. So I don't actually need this default argument here, so I'm just going to delete that. And then what I'll do is I'll pass in an entity manager interface, which I'll call entity manager, and using PHP Storm I'll just initialize that property. In your console command constructors, always make sure that your assignments go before the parent construct call. And so what we're doing here now is that we are going to say this entity manager persist, and we'll pass in the stock, and then we just need to call this entity manager flush. And with that we'll go back to the test and see where that gets us. And we have green. So this is good. Now we know that we can execute a command, and that in executing the command we can store a stock record in the database. What we need to figure out now is, working backwards, what are the steps which precede that, which will get us that data to add to the database. So we need to ping the Yahoo API, grab the response, update the record if it exists. If the record doesn't exist, we need to create one. So that's the route we're going to go down. So we'll make a change to the name of this test, and we'll say refresh the stock profile command behaves correctly when a stock record does not exist. And we'll delete this step there and maybe create another test for updating existing records at a later point. These are now our steps. Ping the Yahoo API and grab a response, which will be a stock profile. Then use the stock profile to create a record if it doesn't exist. We're expecting to have a stock profile, so let's replace all of these values with that and the fields on that stock profile. So for currency, it will be stock profile currency. For exchange name, it will be stock profile exchange name. I'm sure you get the gist. I'll race through some of these. So all of our fields can map directly, except for this last one, price change, which we're going to calculate ourselves, and that will be the stock profile price minus the stock profile previous close. We'll just grab that and copy that in, and then all we need to do is go back and run our tests and see what happens. Okay. Undefined variable stock profile, which is exactly what we're expecting because we don't have a stock profile. We're going to need to grab that from the Yahoo API. But this is good because it gives us a chance to think about our code, what we'd like it to look like, and what kind of experience we'd like another developer to have when they come and use our code for the first time. For a first attempt, how about something like this? So we need to get a stock profile. How about stock profile equals this Yahoo Finance API client. So we can have a client class, which is a property of our command, and then we just need a logical method name to call off of that client. Let's call it fetch stock profiles. No ambiguity there. We already know that the Yahoo Finance API is going to need some information from us, which is the stock symbol and the region, and we already have those because we passed them into the command as arguments. This looks pretty good to me. It's one line, it's easily readable, anyone should be able to know what's happening here. Let's go to our tests. Hopefully it'll tell us that we don't have a Yahoo Finance API client, and that's exactly what we get. Refresh stock profile command, Yahoo Finance API client property does not exist. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to create that. What I'm going to do is in the constructor, I'm going to make up a class called Yahoo Finance API client. I shall initialize that as a property. Remember, you need to add the assignments above the parent construct method. Run our tests again, and here's our next error, and it's saying that the Yahoo Finance API client class was not found. And so this is how it works. We're trying to take our shortest path back to green, and each step of the way PHP unit will tell us what's missing, what do we need to add, what do we need to do. So what I'm doing here is I've created a folder called HTTP in the source folder, and then inside of that I'm creating the Yahoo Finance API client class. Back to the command, and we'll modify our constructor injection to use our new class that we just created. Let's remove all the old references and we'll just reinitialize this property. Don't forget to make sure that you move the assignment above parent construct. Run the tests again. Okay, we're on to our next step. Call to undefined method. Fetch stock profile. So we have our Yahoo Finance API client class now, but what it's saying is that we don't have a fetch stock profile method on that class. Let's create that. Of course, it will need to match the signature that we specified in our command, so it's going to take a symbol and a region as an argument. Then we'll go back, run the tests, and see what we have next. Trying to get property currency of a non-object, line 55. So down to line 55, and as you can see here, we're trying to access a currency property on a stock profile, but we don't actually have a stock profile. And we won't actually have a stock profile until this method is working properly. So we've hit a dependency, we've took this as far as we can get. We can't move on until this fetch stock profile method is fully functional. So we're going to divert our attention and get that working fully. In order for that to work fully, it needs to connect to a third party. So we need to write a special kind of test called an integration test. Okay, before I start trying to ping the API, there's a couple of things I'd like to just take care of first, a couple of edits I'd like to make. This code here, I think we can do quite a lot slicker, so I'm just going to comment that out for the time being. And also, I need to be able to handle non-200 responses, because if I'm getting non-200 responses, it means I've got errors which will prevent me from storing stuff in the database. As far as setting the entity properties is concerned, I'm going to use the deserialize method of the Symfony Serializer component, which is pretty good. With those changes in mind, for the time being, I'm going to return an associative array from the fetch stock profile method. Now, it's not very object oriented, but what we're going to do is get this going for now and refactor it later. So rather than be sidetracked by creating my own classes or whatever, I'm going to just return associative array, have a think about it, and I'm pretty sure there'll be something that I can use to improve this later on. So those two keys are going to be status code, which will be an integer, and content, which will be JSON content. The way we deserialize is this. The first argument is the data to be deserialized, second argument is the class we're deserializing into, and the third argument is the format that the deserialize method should expect. This bit here is just a placeholder. It's going to sit here and not do anything, and it's just there to remind me that I need to come back and handle non-200 status codes before I complete this class. Let's go and run the feature test again and see where we're up to. Okay, so we have an error trying to access array offset and value of type null, line 52. And so where we're trying to access status code, it's telling us here that our dependency isn't working. So we're pretty much where we started off from. So let's go and create that integration test now, and we'll figure out how to get Yahoo Finance API client returning what we need it to return. In my test folder, I've created an integration folder, and inside of the integration folder, I've created the Yahoo Finance API client test. So, surprise, surprise, we're actually going to need the same dependencies, database dependencies, as what we needed for our previous tests. So rather than duplicate for the third time, I'm going to apply the rule of 3 and I'm going to create this database dependent test case in order to do a refactoring. That will sit in the test folder and extend the kernel test case, and then for my other tests I will extend the database dependent test case. I cut the setup and tear down from my refresh stock profile test case, and I just need to set the entity manager to protected in order to make that available in the child classes. So same thing for stock test, remove the setup and tear down and extend the database dependent test case. Let's run the stock test again. And we're still green, so that's working fine. Let's do our feature test. And it's still taking us the exact same error as before, so it looks like our changes are also working there, no problem. Okay, in our Yahoo Finance API client test, we need to extend the database dependent test case. For this particular test, I'm going to add a couple of annotations, the normal test annotation and also a group annotation. So I'm adding this test to a group called integration, and we'll be able to use this later on to exclude this test from running when we run our other tests using some of PHP Unit's built-in functionality. I'm simply going to call this test the Yahoo Finance API client returns the correct data. Usual 3 stages of our test: set up, do something and make assertions. The first thing I'm going to need is a Yahoo Finance API client itself. Now I don't really want to be newing one up in my test because there's a realistic possibility that I may need to auto-wire other services into there, and that could just become a nightmare. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to grab it from the container. And the way I can do that is this: self kernel get container, and then I call get, and I'm passing in a string alias here, which I'll have to establish in my config. Next up is the do something part of our test, and we know what that is. We need to call the fetch stock profile method of the Yahoo Finance API client, and if you remember, that takes 2 arguments, which will be the symbol and also the region. So in our case we're going to use Amazon and US, and then we need to make assertions. So what kind of assertions do we need to make? For the strings, things like symbol, exchange name, etc., these are going to be static. The API is going to return the same data for these every single time we call it. But for some of the numeric values, we're going to get different values. So we need to figure out a way of testing that as well. We're expecting an associative array response. So let's get the data by JSON decoding the content key of the response. So the first ones I'll test are the strings, the static data, which will be unchanged every time. So that's all those: symbol, short name, etc. And then what I'll do is I'll assert that the value I'm getting back is a float for price, previous close, and for price change. So fair enough, I can't check that I'm getting the correct values back, but I can check that I'm getting the correct types. Let's run the test. And so it's saying you have requested a non-existent service, Yahoo Finance API client. So like I said, we're going to have to go over to our config and establish this service. So here I am in config/services.yaml, and underneath the services key I add the name of the service, which we're going to call Yahoo Finance API client, hyphenated lowercase. Then we need to specify the class, and in order to be able to access this in our test, the way that we're trying to is by saying public should be true. Run the test again, see if anything has changed, and it's saying that now on line 22 we're trying to access an array offset on null. So we'll have a look at that. We're trying to access this content key, but the response is null, so that's telling us that we're not getting anything back from the fetch stock profile method, and there's a good reason for that. And there it is, we've not actually written any code inside it. So that's what we're going to take care of now. Here's the Yahoo Finance API documentation. In order to use this, by the way, you're going to need to have an account. All I did was I authenticated using my GitHub account. That's probably the quickest and easiest way to do this. The documentation has an example which uses the PHP extension community library HTTP client. Obviously we're going to use the Symfony HTTP client, but we can look at this and easily figure out what we need to do, I think. Before I start making assertions again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my HTTP client and I'm going to ping that API and grab a response. So I'm adding a constructor to the Yahoo Finance API client. I'm injecting the HTTP client interface. By doing this, Symfony knows to give me the HTTP client component, which I'm going to set as a property, and then to ping the API I just do this HTTP client request, and so the first argument is the method, the second argument is the URL. I'll set this as a private constant on the class, so I'll go over to the API and grab that value, and it's just this string here. So private constant URL equals, there's a URL, and then I add that as the second argument to the request method. And then the third argument is an array of options. What I'm going to need here is the query parameters and the headers. So I'm just going to initialize a couple of empty arrays for the time being, because that's how we set these values. The query parameters is pretty straightforward. There's only two of them and we've seen them already. We just need to pass the symbol, which will be Amazon, and we're already passing in that as an argument. And we'll also need the region, and in our case for this test it's going to be US, and we're also passing that in. I'll set the return response as an array. Our headers is going to be slightly more complex, but the first one's straightforward. We just need this RapidAPI host, which is a string, and we can add this as a private constant by just pasting it in. That takes care of the first one. The second one we're going to need a little more sophistication, because it's for the API key, and obviously for security reasons I don't want to be sharing my API key with everyone, because when you authenticate with the app you get given your own key. So we need to figure out a way of adding that, but without adding it to version control or exposing it in any way whatsoever. And the way we can do it is by binding it as an argument to the service container. So I'm adding this RapidAPI key as a constructor argument. I initialize it as a property and then I just assign it like this. Now I'm going back up to the constructor and I'm going to copy this RapidAPI key variable, because this needs to be spelled exactly the same. I go over to services YAML, and underneath this underscore defaults key I add a key called bind. Underneath that I paste in the RapidAPI key variable, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the value from a local environment variables file, and I'm going to call it rapid_API_key. Next I need to create a .env.local file, which will be ignored from version control, so I can put whatever I like in here, knowing I'm safe that no one else will see it apart from me. I create the RapidAPI key and I just cut and paste that value from the documentation. With that binding in place, now wherever I inject this RapidAPI key variable into my constructors, I will receive my RapidAPI key back, and the value will be whatever I've defined in my local environment variables file. Let's dump out the response and see what we get. Okay, this is looking good. Let's actually dump out the content and see what kind of values we're getting there. We do that by calling the getContent method on the response, and this is looking good. This is JSON content, so we know we can work with this. Let's now resume our test-driven approach. So let's figure out what we need to do. We'll do that by working backwards. We know we need to return an array which comprises of two keys: the status code, which will hardcode as 200, and then we need to return some JSON content, but it's not just any content. We're expecting certain keys in certain formats. I want to take my shortest path back to a green test, and then I can refactor from there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to JSON encode an associative array of the exact keys and values, or types of values, as what my test is expecting. And this hopefully should give us a green test. So let's head over to the terminal and run the integration test again. And there we go, we are back to green. So that's a pretty good start. What I'll do is I'll pull this array out, I'll assign it to a variable, and then what we'll do is we'll look at swapping out each individual value for values that we're actually getting back from the Yahoo API. I think some of these string ones should be fairly straightforward, because they all map with the exact same name and they're all found at the top level of of this price key here. So as you can see, short name, exchange name, currency, all sat at the top level underneath the price key. First things first, we'll decode the response content, and that'll give us a PHP object, nice and easy to work with, and we'll grab the price key. We'll dump that out into the terminal so we don't have to keep going back to documentation, and we should be able to use that data to find exactly what we need for each of our values. So back to the terminal, run the test again. Okay, this is looking good. The Symfony var dumper makes this stuff so easy to read. Let's just pick them off one by one. So I can see short name there. I'll grab that, go back over to the code, and then underneath short name I'm just going to do stock profile, right arrow, short name, and that should work. I've done the same for all the other strings except region. I'm going to take that from the argument that I pass into the method. Now we need to work on these numeric values. So here's one for previous close. I need regular market previous close, and nested underneath that there is a key called raw, R-A-W. So stock profile, regular market previous close, raw. For the price, it's similar. I need regular market price, and nested underneath that there is also a key called raw. So stock profile, regular market price, raw. Now to get the price change, I need to deduct the regular market previous close from regular market price. I think we can run our tests again. Let's go back to the terminal and see what we get. And we're green. Excellent. Now, with me having hard-coded the 200 status code, I'm making the assumption that it'll only reach that point if it's a 200. So I need to put something in here to handle non-200 responses. What I'm going to do for now is just put in a placeholder. It won't actually do anything. It's just an empty if conditional, which will remind me that I need to complete this step at some point. And taking the test-driven approach, I won't actually write any code here anyway without writing the test first. Now I know that my tests are passing, but I just want to have one last sanity check. I'm just going to dump out exactly what is coming back for the stock profile so I can see it with my own eyeballs. And there we go. So we knew what to expect for all the strings, but these are our numerical values, which all look very similar to the ones that we saw in the API documentation. So now we have a Yahoo Finance API client. We've driven out functionality with an integration test. We can now resume where we left off with our feature test, knowing that this is taken care of and it works and it returns the data exactly how we want it. Okay, so picking up where we left off in the last one, we created our Yahoo Finance API client and integration test. That was working fine. We would get the data back from the Yahoo Finance API client. We'd added this serializer, and so now we need to run our feature test and see where we can pick up, and I suspect it's going to tell us we need to create a serializer, and that's exactly what it's telling us to do. So app command, refresh stock profile command, serializer, undefined property. So we're going to need a serializer, and what I'm going to do is inject it into the constructor like I've done with the Entity Manager and the Yahoo Finance API client. We don't currently have a serializer, so let's go to Composer, and you need to make sure that you're getting a serializer pack, not just a serializer component, which you can do with Symfony Composer require serializer. If you don't get the serializer pack, if you just get the component, then you'll be missing encoders, normalizers, etc., which will make this work. So I've done my constructor injection, and you'll notice I'm using the serializer interface, which comes from Symfony Component Serializer interface. I think we can run our test again and see where this gets us. And so we have a new error. The type of the price attribute for class stock must be one of string. So this is actually the default behavior for Doctrine, to force decimals to be strings. So if you think back to when we created this entity, we specified decimals for price, previous close and price change. But if you look at these setter methods, and also the getters for that matter, Doctrine has type hinted strings. The way that I'm going to remedy it in this instance is I'm just going to change these to floats, because for this application we don't need that level of precision that decimals give us. It's not like this is a banking application. All we're doing is storing the values that the API sends back to us. So in this instance we can use floats. I'll go and find all of these references to decimal. I should be able to change them all in one go using PHP Storm's functionality. And I think there's one more up at the top. Okay, there we go, previous close. With that done, let's go over, run the tests with our fingers crossed. I'm hoping we'll get a green. And we do, which is great. So that means I can remove all this stuff here because that's all now taken care of with this one line of code. The deserialize method of the serializer does it all for us. What I'd like to do now is address these test times because, as you can see here, 2.37 seconds, 1.63 seconds. It's a long time, especially for this kind of test. And the reason it's taking this long is because it's pinging the API. We don't actually need to be pinging the API in our feature test because we've taken care of that in our integration tests. A feature test like this should only run for milliseconds. So what do I propose? Well, I've never been totally happy with this anyway because I'm coding to a concrete implementation. In its current state, our application is hard-coded to one third-party dependency, which isn't good news because things can change, APIs suddenly disappear off the face of the earth, people can put the prices up, they can change their APIs without telling you. So if I swap this out for an interface here, then it makes us more loosely coupled, more future-proof, and it also means that I can use a fake when my tests run. That's exactly what I'll do. So in the same HTTP folder as the Yahoo Finance API client, I'm creating an interface called Finance API Client Interface, and that is what I'll inject into the command. This will enforce just one method, and that is the fetch stock profile method, which we've already been using, so hopefully it won't break any of our code. We'll just be able to carry on as we are. And if you recall, that method took just two string arguments, which were symbol and also the region. Then we need to go over to our refresh stock profile command. We'll change the concrete class for the interface, and we'll also rename this because we're no longer saying it's going to be a Yahoo Finance API client, just making it a lot more abstract, and we'll call it Finance API Client. I hope my reasons for doing this are clear to you so far. If you do have any questions regarding this, then be free to start a discussion in the comments below. I do respond to them all. Let's now go over to the test, run the test, and see where that brings us to. Okay, so it's saying argument Finance API Client of method construct references interface Finance API Client interface, but no such service exists. So a couple of things. We've not actually implemented the interface in any of our classes yet, and we also need to tell our application to use a fake when we run our tests. I'm going to go over to the services or the config/services YAML file and start to define the expected behavior. So this is the expected behavior for dev and production. When I ask for a Finance API Client interface, give me back a Yahoo Finance API Client. Let's go and run the test. Okay, so it's saying that the construct method must implement interface Finance API Client interface, but it's getting the Yahoo Finance API Client because we haven't actually implemented the interface in the Yahoo Finance API Client yet. Let's go over and do that now. So Yahoo Finance API Client implements Finance API Client interface. Let's go back and run our tests, and I think that should get us back to where we were. Great, back to green. So just to be clear, whenever we ask the container for the Finance API Client interface, we're getting a Yahoo Finance API Client. As you can see from the test, that's still taking a while, and it's because we're still using, or should I say behind the scenes, we're still using the Yahoo Finance API Client, and we're still making that call to the third-party service. Let's take care of that now. So what I'm going to do in the config folder is I'm going to create a services_test.yaml file, and this is convention if we want to create test overrides. So just like our services file, I create a services key, and so what I'm creating here is a binding where when I ask for the Finance API Client interface, I will get back a fake Yahoo Finance API Client. So let's run the tests and see where we're up to. And we're getting green, so you'd probably think that we should get a failure because we haven't actually created a fake Yahoo Finance API client. But what actually happens is it has a look, sees it hasn't got one, and it just reverts and gives us the Yahoo Finance API client. So we need to go and create that fake. So in the same folder, HTTP, I'm creating the class fake Yahoo Finance API client. And this will need to implement Finance API client interface. Run the test again. Okay, this is good. Because we implement the interface, we need to implement the fetch stock profile method. But more importantly, what that tells us is that we are now using the fake. This is a big step in the right direction. Let's implement an empty method and run the test again. So I've just got PHP Storm to do that for me. And we're back to an error that we've seen before, and that is that we're trying to access array values off of null. And so our stock profile that we're getting back from our fetch stock profile does not have a value because we're not returning anything. So let's go and borrow from our Yahoo Finance API client. We'll take this return, which is an associative array with two keys, status code and content. So status code is straightforward. I'll just leave that as 200. To get the content, what I'm going to do is comment out the use of the fake. That means it'll revert to using the real Yahoo Finance API client. And I'm just going to dump out the content because I want to replicate what that's returning, and the best way to do that is to simply cut and paste it. So I'll run the test again, and I'll grab all this. Then I need to go back to the code. I'll just remove this dump, and then back to the fake Yahoo Finance API client, and I'll just paste that in. Tidy this up a little bit. Go over to the services_test file and uncomment this. Run the test again. And we're back to green in 630 milliseconds, so that means that we're using our fake and it's returning us the correct data. Now this is okay, but I don't like the hard coding, because what if you want to test the handling of different responses? What I'm going to do is replace the response values with static properties, and then I can change them on the fly in my tests if I need to do that. Status code, I'll give a default value of 200, so public static status code equals 200. And for the content, I'll just give that an empty string. So public static content is an empty string, and that'll have to be set in my test, which isn't a problem. Let's go over to the test and do that now. So in refresh stock profile command test, in the setup part, I need to add a fake to return. So fake Yahoo Finance API client, content, and then I'll just paste in that string again. Now logically nothing has changed, so hopefully our test should still pass. There we go, 548 milliseconds, all looking good. Let's now run all our tests. So we've got a unit test, a feature test and an integration test. We've never actually ran them all at once before, so this should be interesting. Okay, we've got 3 tests, 22 assertions, and it's running in 1.84 seconds. Now, we know that our integration test is passing. Do we need to run it every time and see that delay? We can actually exclude it by using this flag here, exclude-group, and we added it to a group called integration, and there you go, it runs a lot faster, and it just runs the unit tests and feature tests and excludes the integration test. Okay, while we're in the mood for improving things, let's have a look at this return from the Yahoo Finance API client. When I created it, I said I wasn't totally happy with returning an array. I much prefer objects. They give you more flexibility, more power. We're writing object-oriented code. Let's try and return objects where we can. So with the Symfony HTTP client, we can access methods like this: response get content and response get status code. So I've added that to my test. Obviously it's not going to work, but I'm going to run it. We're going to try and get our code to work like this, and we'll work backwards. So we'll run the integration test again, and obviously we get an error. Call to member function, get content on an array, because our response is an array at the moment. Now it's not possible to modify the content of the HTTP client response and just pass that back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use another Symfony class, and that is JSON response, which comes from Symfony component HTTP foundation. So this takes the stock profile as array as the first argument, the status code as the second argument. I need to tell the fetch stock profile method to return a JSON response instead. I'm going to run the tests, and amazingly that also passes. And the reason why it passes is because JSON response also has get content and get status code methods. Okay, so I can go down and clean out this. We don't need this array return anymore. And what I'm going to do is run the feature test and see what happens there. Now when we run our feature test, then the fake gets injected, so nothing changes, the test still passes. Let's go over to the refresh stock profile command and we'll implement our change, which uses the get status code method calls and also the get content method call. So stock profile get status code, stock profile get content. Now the fake is still returning an array. Call to a member function get status code on array. Let's change that. It's easy enough to do, so we'll delete this array and we'll type in a JSON response, and we're going to actually have to do the return a little bit different this time because our content is already in JSON format, so we need to let the JSON response class know that. I do actually think it'd be good to pass in an associative array and have that flexibility, but we're working towards a test. We don't need that requirement at the moment. This third argument should be an array of headers. I'll leave that empty, and the fourth argument is a boolean to say whether the content is already in JSON format or not. In our case it already is, so we pass true, the default is false. Run the tests again and we're back to green. Let's run all of our other tests. So first off, let's run the integration test. No problems there. Let's run all of the tests. All good. And finally, let's run our tests and exclude the integration test. We do that with this -exclude -group integration. All green. And I think it's possible that on the majority of occasions I'm going to want to run the test minus the integration test. So let's make that the rule rather than the exception. I do that by adding an entry to the PHP unit XML file. So underneath this test suites element, I'm going to add a new element called groups. Inside of that, I need to add an exclude element, and then it's inside of that exclude element which I add my group, which we are calling integration. And so now I can go back to my tests. I can run them without using the exclude group integration, and that works. If I do want to run the integration group, I just need to do this -group and then the name of the group, which is integration, and doing that it will run it in isolation like so. Okay, so we have our happy path test where everything works and the world is wonderful. Now we need to start thinking about when things don't quite go to plan and we don't get a happy response back from the API. It's essential that we catch that and handle it, because otherwise our application is going to continue to try and persist the stock with data that it won't be able to persist the stock with. Obviously this is going to throw exceptions in our own application. So let's create a new test. And what we're going to test here is how to handle non-200 responses. Now I think we've got all the tools that we need in order to be able to fake a non-200 response. So our setup's going to be fairly similar, except we'll need to fake a different response status code and different response content. So I'm going to copy and paste these first few lines here. So same stuff there, application equals new application, command, same again, command tester, same again. I'm setting the status code to 500, and I think initially the route I'm going to go down is anything I get back which isn't a 200 response, I'm going to intercept and add my own handling and my own error message to that from my Finance API client. So in this case we'll just say Finance API client error. Executing the command is going to be exactly the same, so I can copy that. I can also copy this line to get the repo. Here's a trick: if you're using PHP Storm, you can do Shift Command V or Shift Control V, and that'll give you a list of things which you can choose and paste. I think it's the last 10 items that you copied. Now in the refresh stock profile command, you'll see that we're returning this constant here, success, and it equates to 0, and on failure it returns a 1. So we can actually hook into that and assert that the process has failed and we're returning a 1 response. I can get that value as the return value of the command tester execute method. So I'll save that in a variable called command status, and so I'm asserting that command status equals 1. Let's also assert that no records have been saved in the database, which shouldn't happen if we're exiting the command early. The way I'd like to do this is just by checking the value of a stock record count variable. So now we need to give that variable a value, and we can just use the query builder to do a count of the number of stock records in the database. So repo create query builder. The string that I'm passing in here, stock, that's an alias. You can put anything. A lot of people will just use S, but I like to write things in full. And so by counting the number of stock IDs, I'm counting the number of rows in the stock table. And hopefully we should get 0 back. So I need to call get query, and then just to get the single scalar result, I call get single scalar result. So it'll just be my integer value. It won't be wrapped in an array or anything like that. Okay, let's run that test and see how we get on. So I'm going to filter and then run the test in isolation. So here we have an exception which is being thrown from our serializer, and as we said, we shouldn't actually be hitting the serializer. We need to exit before that. So refresh stock profile command line 65, and that's exactly where our serializer is. So what's our shortest path back to green? And I'm pretty sure we can do this with one line code by returning the failure constant from the command class. So return command failure. We shouldn't hit this, and we should kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Run the tests, and there we go. And I'll also run all the tests. So they're all passing. What I need to do is make sure that my real Yahoo Finance API client is matching what the fake is returning. So I'm going to set the content or the JSON content to be exactly the same here. So in the Yahoo Finance API client, and within the if conditional which checks the status code, I'm just going to return the same content, and for anything which is not a 200, I'm going to hijack that and change that to a 400. With those tests in place, I now want to give this a go in development mode. I want to go to my terminal and actually run a command. In order to do that, I'm first going to need a development database. And so I'm going to create one using Docker. It's entirely up to you what you use. If you want to use your local MySQL, Postgres or whatever, then do that. But I'm going to do it this way. If you're not familiar with Symfony's integration with Docker, then by all means give it a go. Never pass up the opportunity to learn something new. You will need to create a Docker Compose YAML file in your project root like this, and you can just copy these settings here. You'll also need to create a Postgres folder in the project root also. And of course you'd need to have Docker Desktop installed on your host machine. But if you've not used Docker before and you find it quite daunting, then just stick to what you know. Stick to your local database setup that you're already using. Okay, with everything in place there, I just need to run this command, docker compose up -d, and this should build me a Postgres 13 database in Docker. Okay, that's that done. I'm going to run docker compose ps, which will show me the status of that, and I'll be able to grab the port number which I'll need if I'm going to connect to a database administration tool. And so it's telling me that the port number is 55001 to do that. Now back to more familiar Symfony doctrine territory. Let's make the migration with Symfony console make :migration. And in our migrations folder, this is what we just created. Now, if you're using a different database, if you're not using Postgres, yours will look a little different than this. But if you are using Postgres, it should look fairly similar. Once you've given the migration file a quick inspection, it's time to migrate our database, which we can do with Symfony console doctrine :migrations :migrate. It'll ask you if you're sure. I'm just going to select yes, and then in my database admin tool, I can see it's created 2 tables. One is my migrations and the other one is an empty stock table, which looks exactly how I want it to. And now it's the moment of truth. So I'm going to copy the name of the command over to the terminal, and it's Symfony console. I'll paste in the name of the command, and my 2 arguments were the symbol and the region, which were Amazon and US. Now something happened, but we don't have feedback. Let's check our database tool, refresh, and there we go. There's our record in the database. But I wasn't happy with our lack of feedback in the terminal. Now, in reality, this is going to be run on a cron. There won't be someone checking the terminal. It's just an automated process which will run in the background. However, just for a sanity check whilst we're in development, let's have some feedback in the terminal, and we can do that with this. So if you see the 2 interfaces which are being injected into the method there, what we'll get back is actually a stream output. And with that we can call the write line method. So what we'll do there is just write out the string short name appended with has been saved, and then we also need to handle the failure, and for that what we'll do is we'll just use the failure content that we've got here. So we can grab that by saying stock profile get content, and that's better than nothing. Let's go over and run the command again and see what we get. So that's a big improvement already. Amazon has been saved. And refresh the database and there it is. So we're recording duplicates. Make a mental note, we need to change that. Let's try a different symbol. Let's try Tesla. Okay, Tesla has been saved. Refresh and there you go, it's in our database also. Now I'm conscious that we've broken protocol there because we've actually wrote code before we've written a test for it. The good news is that this stuff is testable, so let's go back to our test and I'll show you how you do this. It's so simple. I've made a copy of the output string and I'm going to use the assert string contains string assertion. Paste that in and then we're comparing it against command tester get display. Okay, let's go and run this test in isolation. So filter, paste in the test name, run that. Okay, 8 assertions, all green. That's happy path taken care of. Let's now deal with our non-200 test. And so I'm going to do the same assertion again, assert string contains string, but this time we're going to need this error string. And we'll go and paste that in, and we're making the assertion against the same value again, against command tester get display. Over to the terminal, let's run this in isolation. And we have a failure. So it's saying failed asserting that 3 matches expected 0. Let's have a look at our test again. And we're expecting a count of 0, but it's saying that we've got 3. Let's go and look at our dev database. And as you can see, there's 3 records there. So something's gone wrong, and you'll only actually have this error if you followed my Docker setup. When I prepend my test with the word Symfony, the local Symfony server is used, and that detects that I have a Docker Compose running. Now, mainly as consideration for people who ain't using Docker that are following this, I'll not turn this into a Docker lesson, but the short version is my database URL environment variable is now pointing to the database service in the Docker Compose file. So we need to remedy this, because as it stands when our test run, this database URL isn't being read from our env test file and this service is still being used instead. Let me run the test without using Symfony binary and I'll show you what happens. So in that scenario we are passing. I'll run it again with the Symfony and it's failing. Now I don't really want to switch between using those two methods, because what if I want to add more services to my Docker Compose file? It means that those won't work in tests. So what I'm going to do is in my test folder, my package folder inside of config, I'm going to create a test doctrine YAML file. I'm pasting in the entry from my regular doctrine config file, and I'm going to prepend the database URL environment variable with the word test underscore. When I run my test doctrine YAML file is the one which overrides. So let's run the test again. It fails, but I'm pretty sure it should pass. When you change your environment variable files, always clear the cache, because your environment variables get cached. So I'm going to clear the test cache, and I can do that by specifying the test environment before I actually clear the cache. So it's Symfony console cache clear. That's cleared my test cache. Let's go and run the test again with our fingers crossed. And we're back to green. That's great. So let's run the full file. Okay, let's run all of the tests. And also let's run our integration test in isolation. Let's start off by addressing this situation here. Every time I run the command, it's creating duplicates. I don't want duplicates. What I want to do is update existing records in the database if they exist. So I'm going to rename this test here to creates new records correctly, and I'll create a new test and I'm going to call it the refresh stock profile command updates existing records correctly. I'll add my test annotation to that, and I'm going to borrow the setup from another test. Now it looks like I'm duplicating every time I run a test, but it's not part of my application code, or I don't consider my test to be part of application code. Tests are tests and application code is application code. The reason why I like to keep it all in each individual test is I like to read each one like a story and see exactly what steps I've taken to set up, etc. I don't want to have to go looking for that in the rest of my code. Now what I'm doing here is creating an existing stock which will exist in the database before the command is run, and so when the command executes I need to test that I'm not creating a new stock, but that this one is getting updated. So I'm going to grab the stock ID, as I'm going to need that to peek into the database to look for existing records. Now these string records that you see at the top, I expect those to stay the same, but these numeric values are the ones which I expect to change. For setting the content, I'd like to do something like this. The string has served us well so far, but I'd like something a bit more dynamic, a bit more parameterized, where I can pass in an array of values and internally it will be converted to a JSON string. So what I'm doing here is just passing in the values that my fake Yahoo Finance API is going to return. So I'll copy these from a previous test. That copies them all to the clipboard, and if you're using PHP Storm like me, if you do Shift Command V, that'll bring up a little menu of recently copied items, and you can just paste them in. So again, Shift Command V, find the one I want, paste. If you're on Windows or Linux, it'll be Shift Control V, but I'm sure you knew that already, didn't you? So paste in our last one here and just tidy this up. So this looks pretty good. All we need to do now is go over to the fake Yahoo Finance API client. Here's another one for you. Pub SF tab will stub out a public static function skeleton for you. So I just need to add the name. And so this is going to take an array of overrides, and within the method there will be a existing array of defaults, which I shall merge the overrides into the existing. So self content equals array merge. The first array will be my existing ones, and then the overrides will be merged in with the existing array, and the overrides will take precedence if there are duplicate keys. And as you saw there, I'll just set the string values as the defaults, which can be overridden. Now that we've set the content, let's just dump it out and see what we're getting back, just to check that this is working. So I'm going to grab the test name, go over to the test, and I do this kind of thing all the time while I'm working out a test, just keep dumping stuff out, going back to the terminal and seeing what kind of values that I'm getting. Okay, that looks good, but it's not right because it's an array and I'm expecting a string, but the values looked correct. So progress, we just need to encode this array. So let's now go back to the terminal, run it again, and that is beautiful, exactly what we want. Bit of a sidetrack to create that there, but I think you'll agree that we've now got something which is much better for setting our fake Yahoo Finance API client content. Let's change the status code to 200, and then we need to do the do something part of our test. So I can go and borrow that from another test because it's the same for each one. We're just going to fire off the execute method on the command tester, and then I need to make some assertions. So what is it that I need to assert? Well, I want to check that the existing stock, the one that I created here, has been updated, and that the values for previous close price and price change now all match those which I set with my fake Yahoo API client. I'll grab that stock using the stock repository, and this is how I get that. This entity manager, get repository, pass in the name of the entity, and then to get the stock record it's just repo and then find, and you can just pass in the ID, and that's why I grabbed that ID there. I know that the ID will be unique for each record, and so it will be a true test. And now I'm just going to make assertions. So I want to assert that the stock record now has these values. So this assert equals, and I'll go and grab this previous close value here, paste that in there, and then it's stock record get previous close. And I'll do the exact same thing for the other two. You don't need to watch me do them all. What we do need to do is check that we only have one record in the database. So again, we can go and steal from our other tests. In fact, we'll grab all these lines here and we'll check those extra bits as well. So we'll just tidy this up, remove that. The command status, we actually expect it to be 0 if it runs successfully. And so just to be clear, what I'm looking for in my test is for the one record that we created to have been updated. These values should change to the ones we set with our fake, and I still want to see only one record in the database. Let's run it and see how we get on. It's a failure, but it's a good failure. It's basically saying it's found the record in the database, but it hasn't been updated, which is what we expect because we've not written the code to update it. So it's a failure, but it's a good failure. In refresh stock profile command, here are the steps we need to take in order to get us back to green. So we need to try and find the record in the database using the stock profile symbol. And if we find it, we'll update it. If not, we'll create a new one. So I'm grabbing the symbol from the stock profile, and I do that by JSON decoding stock profile get content. Ideally, on that content, there should be a symbol key. If not, we're just going to set symbol to null. Using that symbol, I'm going to try and find a record in the database. So I can inline it all inside an if conditional, if stock equals, and on the stock repository, I'm going to call the find one by method, which takes an array, and that will be symbol. And like I say, if one's found, we're going to update it. So we'll just move that comment up to there. Otherwise, we'll just create the new one, and we've already got the code for that. We know how to create a stock using deserialization, but how do we actually update an existing stock using deserialization? Well, it's not too dissimilar. So what we're going to do is copy that from there, and then the deserialize method, it takes 4 arguments. We've only been using 3. The 4th argument is a context array, and in that we're going to use the abstract normalizer and set the object to populate constant to our stock. So the first 3 params, as usual, are data, type, and format. Abstract normalizer can be found in Symfony, component, serializer, normalizer, abstract normalizer. Let's go and roll the dice with our fingers crossed. Failed asserting that 1 matches 0 on line 112. Of our test, which is the stock record count, and we had that wrong. So it should be 1, we had 0. Might be a good idea to put a comment in here to explain what's going on. So we're checking that there's no duplicates, i.e. there should be 1 record instead of 2. Back to the test, run that again, and we are agreeing with 5 assertions. Life is good. Let's take this for a test drive in dev mode. So we'll delete this duplicate, and we'll go over and actually run the command from the console. So Symfony console, command name followed by any arguments, which are Amazon and US. And it's telling us that Amazon has been saved or updated. Refresh, and those values have been updated. Perfect. What I'd like to talk about now is dealing with the unexpected, because when you're working with third-party APIs, one thing's for sure is that you need to expect the unexpected. So this is okay, but it's all a bit happy path and things could go wrong. We don't know what those things are, but I'm not sure that our application is equipped to deal with it. Here's an example. My application is set up to deal with non-200 responses. So it's reasonable to assume that if I was to put something like foobar as a symbol, I would get a status code back which signifies that a resource hasn't been found, so probably something in the 400 range. When my application receives a 200, it's going to handle it gracefully. No unexpected exceptions will be thrown, and the command will just exit with a failure status. Let's run the command and test that theory. Trying to get property price of non-object Yahoo Finance API client, line 44. Let's go and see what's going on there. So here's line 44 of the Yahoo Finance API client, and we're hitting this line. We expected that this condition here will be met, but obviously it's not being met. The status code must be 200, so the inside of the if block is getting skipped over. Let's dump out the content and have a look at exactly what we're getting back from this call. So over to the terminal, run it again, and we're getting an empty string, and that should tell you a lot about what you need to know about dealing with third-party APIs. So how do we handle this? Should we go and add some error handling to our initial call here? What about this conditional? Do we also need to be checking for empty content? Let's remove this dump here. Here where we're decoding the content, do we also need to add a null coalescer on the end? Let's go over and look at our refresh stock profile command, and there's got to be at least 4 lines there which could throw exceptions, but the thing is we don't know what they are. So if you don't know, don't guess. by throwing in a load of error handling before we even have a good idea of where the errors might be thrown. 1, we're going to create a massive mess, and 2, it's all guesswork. When you're dealing with the unknown like we are here, the alternative to guessing is to learn, log and learn, and so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to create a nice wide net by putting a try block before we make the call, and this will wrap around the whole lot. And then I'm going to catch every exception, and in my catch block I'm going to log everything that I think might be useful to me. So you'd have this process running on a pre-prod server before it goes into full production for at least a couple of weeks, pinging that API, getting responses back, learning what kind of errors you're going to get back, and it's with that knowledge that you can make informed decisions on what kind of error handling you're going to need and where you're going to need it, rather than just throwing in try catch blocks here, there and everywhere all over your code. You'll gain confidence in your system when you know what errors you're getting and you know that you've got the right handling in place. With that lecture out of the way, let's add some logging. So I'm going to go up to the constructor and I'm going to inject logger interface, which comes from PSR logger interface, which is pretty much the standard interface for dependency injection and logging. Initialize that as a property, make sure again it goes above the parent call, and then we just need to log something. So this logger, and here we've got a bit of a menu. Error might be okay. Let's go and check this out in the logger interface file. And if you read the doc block for warning, this actually looks more suitable. Example, use of deprecated APIs, poor use of an API, undesirable things are not necessarily wrong. Sounds perfect for us, so we'll change this to warning. And these log methods take a couple of arguments. The first one is a message, which is mandatory. The second one is a context array, which is optional. So I'm just going to do the message. So what I'm passing here is I'm getting the exception class. I'm going to get the exception message file number, line number, and then I'm also going to pass in the symbol and the region, which are being used to call the API, because I think that will be useful debugging information for us. With that in place, we now need a logger. So what I'm going to do is get monologue. So Symfony Composer require monologue. This will install monologue bundle. As you can see, I've still not updated to Composer 2, so I'm only a few months late. I'll do that this week. When we install monologue, that becomes our default logger. We don't have to do anything else, so we can run the command. And as you can see, it also logs it out to our terminal, which is quite handy. You'll find configuration for all this stuff in config packages. Let's now have a look at the devlog, which has been created. And you're going to need good eyes, but second to bottom here is what we just logged. So it's an error exception, and it's saying we're trying to get the price of a non-object. But we don't want all this other stuff because it's just creating noise in our file. So let's go over to our config and we'll find the dev monologue file. And I'm just going to change the level to warning. So all this debug messages won't be logged in the file. We'll go and run it again, but what I'll do is I'll actually delete this one and we'll create one from fresh, and hopefully we'll get something a bit more streamlined. Run the command. Creates our new log file, and this is looking much better. So I've got one line, and even though it's only one line, with this information here, I believe I could start debugging. So I've got an error exception saying trying to get property price of a non-object in the Yahoo Finance API client on line 44, and we've used the symbol foobar and the region US. And so you analyze your log file, and if there's a particular exception in there where you don't believe you've got enough information to debug, then what you can do is catch that particular exception and also log out the backtrace, and that will give you more information and you can learn more that way. But to start off with, just log one line like this and see how far that'll take you. After you've run this in pre-prod for 2 or 3 weeks, you'll be much more better equipped to handle the errors than if you were just going to try and guess what kind of errors you're going to get up front. And so, believe it or not, that concludes these recordings. I only intended to record a single 20-minute video on this stuff, but here we are, 6 videos and 90 minutes later still having fun. But that's the nature of software, I guess. Everything always takes longer than anticipated and usually costs more as well. But it needn't be the end. If you've enjoyed this test-driven approach, let me know about it. There is potential to build this out, possibly with login, user interfaces, maybe some search, background tasks, payments, etc. I welcome your suggestions and feedback. In fact, HttpClient and TDD were both suggestions which I received, so you do have a voice. Make yourself heard in the comments below this video. If you've enjoyed this video, or indeed if you've enjoyed this series, be sure to give it a like and don't hesitate to share if you want to help others like yourself. That's what good developers do. If you want YouTube to show you more of my content, all you need to do is subscribe and click the little notification icon. I record new material 2 times a week, and details of my schedule can be found on the discussion tab of my YouTube channel homepage.